How do you feel about medication? That's a question that I often ask when sitting across from a client who's grappling with just intense symptoms of whatever mental illness they're experiencing. It's a simple question, but as a therapist, I've come to find that it hardly ever has a simple answer. Because for some, it's not just a question about a pill. It's about autonomy. It's about trust. It's about knowing if it'll even help. For some, they worry that psychiatry and psychotherapy are medicalizing and medicating our humanity away. Worry that we're just masking societal problems. Worry that it'll cause more harm than good. Worry that they're coercive instruments of oppression. And those worries? Well, there's something to them. We live in an era where trust in institutions is dwindling, from governments to media, banks to tech giants, religion to science. I make a lot of videos about mental health and therapy and interesting forms of treatment, psychology stuff. And over the years, as I've seen the comments roll in on those videos, I feel like I've had a front row seat to a growing sentiment about this field. My field. It's not new though. In fact, it's been around for more than 60 years. But it feels different. It feels bigger. I'm talking about the apparent rebirth of anti-psychiatry. I'm not sure how many of you watching know exactly what it is, but I'm guessing that most of you can immediately understand exactly what I'm talking about. So, in this video, we're diving into the controversial world of the anti-psychiatry movement, because this is a conversation we can't afford to ignore. This video was sponsored by Nebula. Before we go any further, I actually want to get your unbiased perspective. What are your thoughts or feelings or experiences regarding psychiatry and psychotherapy? In general, are they positive or negative? You could pause right now, write your comment down below. I'm not going anywhere, right? I'll be here. And we're not asking you to do this to juice the algorithm or anything. YouTube doesn't care about comments on videos, but I'm just genuinely curious. All right, you done? Good? Right, so now that you've done that, or just ignored me, we need to talk about the anti-psychiatry movement and the term anti-psychiatry itself. And the first thing that you need to know about being anti-psychiatry is that nobody agrees on what it is, nobody proudly self-identifies as anti-psychiatry, and nobody likes the term in the first place because, quite honestly, it's a bit derogatory. It's kind of like calling someone a conspiracy theorist. It's not a compliment, it's pretty vague, and it can mean very different things to different people. But despite that, it's the term we got, so I'll be using it throughout this video, and hopefully by explaining it, I can connect the dots. Maybe with some red string, I don't know. The second thing that you need to know about the anti-psychiatry movement is that it isn't quite what you might imagine when you think of a social movement, like Occupy Wall Street, or March for Our Lives, or the women's suffrage movement. It's much looser and less organized. It's more of a label that gets applied to a broad group of people who have some level of disagreement with psychiatry for one reason or another. So that could include patients, their families, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and especially Scientologists, but we'll get back to them later. Basically, what I'm trying to say is it's an umbrella term, and as such, it encompasses a wide range of perspectives from those who critique maybe only one aspect of how psychiatry is practiced, to those who feel that psychiatry should be abolished altogether. But the overall vibe is that psychiatry is, in part or in whole, doing more harm than good. Now, I keep saying the word psychiatry, which probably conjures images of a doctor whose job primarily involves prescribing psychotropic medication. But the anti-psychiatry movement doesn't only take issue with meds, or only with psychiatrists. It also takes aim at psychotherapy, my line of work, psychology writ large, mental health facilities, and systemic failures that supposedly produce social problems. I bring that up just so that you know that when I'm talking about anti-psychiatry, it's generally referring to the mental health field as a whole. Skepticism, criticism, and the pursuit of change have always been intertwined with the formal treatment of mental illnesses. While the concept of madness has existed throughout human history, psychiatry only emerged as a medical specialty in the 18th century. But already by the latter part of that century, there was public outrage against the brutal physical restraints and inhumane therapies that were frequently used at madhouses. This uproar led to the so-called moral treatment of the mentally disturbed, which took a more humane approach to caring for them, which then led to the formation and proliferation of asylums. Yep, believe it or not, asylums were once considered a progressive approach to treatment. I actually made a whole video about the checkered past of asylums where I lay out a lot of this interesting history that I'm just not gonna repeat here. But I'm genuinely very proud of that video. A security guard at the abandoned asylum I was filming in front of tried to kick me out. So yeah, definitely worth a watch. And probably not one you've seen because it didn't perform that well, but that's my fault because it was a pretty crappy thumbnail that I made. It's still kind of crappy. Anyway, after World War II, psychology, psychiatry, and psychotherapy grew in popularity and recognition. Now that was largely due to the significant number of people who experienced war-related PTSD, or shell shock as it was called back then, as well as other mental health problems. Families and communities saw firsthand how war changed these soldiers' minds, which then changed their minds about how they viewed mental illness. Instead of seeing them as some sort of moral failing, they started seeing them as medical issues that could be treated. This cultural shift, as well as the sheer number of soldiers in need of help, led the US government to put substantial resources toward funding mental health research and services. And that funding had ripple effects. More departments in psychology and psychiatry popped up at universities and colleges, churning out more professionals in the field, which boosted its growth. The practice of psychotherapy was taken up by non-medical professionals, such as clinical psychologists. Before then, pretty much only psychiatrists provided therapy, but the demand at the time was too high for them to keep up. However, perhaps the largest ripple at this time was the psychopharmacology revolution of the 1950s. This decade kicked off both the discovery and the rapid development of psychotropic medications. In 1948, so not the 50s, but close enough, lithium salts were discovered to be effective mood stabilizers in the treatment of manic depression. Lithium is still used today primarily for the treatment of bipolar disorder, which is what they were talking about. In 1952, researchers found that patients became inappropriately happy when given the drug iproniazid, which was an antibiotic developed to treat tuberculosis. However, it turned out that they had discovered the first MAOI, which became the first antidepressant medication. Also in 1952, a new drug called chlorpromazine was noted for its calming effects and was initially used to help patients calm down before undergoing surgery. However, it was quickly identified as a possible treatment for psychosis and was soon tested on individuals with schizophrenia, with great success. You may know this drug by the name it was marketed under, Thorazine. After Thorazine, other variants of the chlorpromazine chemical compound were also tested on patients with schizophrenia to see if they might also be useful as forms of treatment. One of these, imipramine, was not. In fact, it seemed to actually make things worse, making patients with schizophrenia more agitated and more psychotic. However, researchers realized that this drug might have a positive effect on people with depression. And after testing confirmed this speculation, it became another antidepressant medication by the mid to late 1950s. Now, unlike iproniazid, which is an MAOI, imipramine was the first tricyclic antidepressant, which inhibited serotonin and noradrenaline reuptake. So you can thank its discovery for the later development of modern SSRIs and SNRIs. This rapid advancement of medications marked a significant turning point for psychiatry. You see, prior to the 1950s, psychiatrists generally resisted the use of medication as a treatment for mental disorders, and instead relied more on things like Freud's psychoanalytic approach. But these medications produced rapid changes, often for conditions that were viewed as difficult to treat. So this led many professionals to embrace a fresh perspective on mental illness, viewing them as manifestations of a chemical imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain. And as a result, many psychiatrists came to believe that you could heal someone's pathology just through the right mix of psychotropic medications. If you fix the imbalance, then you fix the person's disordered behavior and cognition. Simple, right? But of course, not all aspects of psychiatry at the time were positive. In the post-World War II era, lobotomies started being used as a treatment for mental illnesses. It was initially seen as a miracle cure, and almost 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States by 1951. Compulsory electroconvulsive therapy and insulin shock therapy became popular forms of treatment around that same time, but were also met with criticism for being unscientific and inhumane, both because they seem like violations of people's rights and because, insulin shock therapy literally put people into comas on purpose. Asylums, which were meant to be places of comfort and refuge for the seriously mentally ill, became underfunded and overpopulated. Due to state budget cuts, they were chronically understaffed, and then local governments, in an effort to save money themselves, redefined senility as a psychiatric problem, and then funneled elderly patients into these state-run facilities. The lack of staffing, money, and space meant that asylums became a breeding ground for abuse, neglect, and corruption. Again, check out my video from like 2 years ago or whatever. I go way more in depth, and it's just wild. And to top it all off, some of those medications from the psychopharmacology revolution ended up being too good to be true. Thorazine in particular became a target of criticism due to the serious adverse effects that accompany the drug, such as tardive dyskinesia. I mean, the drug was intended to treat psychosis and agitation in schizophrenia, and it did, to the extent that it made patients into drooling shells of themselves. Rightfully so, many people viewed the use of Thorazine as a way of controlling patients rather than treating them. And it's often referred to as a chemical straitjacket because its tranquilizing effects make people so docile that they lose their own sense of agency and will. Another important factor to mention here is that the anti-psychiatry movement coincided with the deinstitutionalization movement, which shared a lot of the same concerns and criticisms. Now, that should perhaps come as no surprise, as both of those also overlapped with the counterculture movement. This era challenged established political, social, and cultural norms, which gave rise to new, radical, culturally liberal ideas, including civil rights and racial equality, anti-war activism, women's liberation, free love, psychedelic drug culture, communes, and, of course, hippies. Given this context, it seems almost obvious and maybe even inevitable that psychiatry would also be scrutinized during this time. The goal of the deinstitutionalization movement was to replace asylums and other large psychiatric institutions with community-based mental health centers where people could get care in their own neighborhood, rather than being locked up somewhere far away. And while it was very successful at closing many asylums after President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act in 1963, it was not so successful in many other ways. But I'm not going to get into that right now. I do talk about it in my asylum video, which I'll mention again. Just go watch it. The point I'm trying to make is that the anti-psychiatry movement and the deinstitutionalization movement came out of the same cultural moment. They are cut from the same cloth. Ironically, though, deinstitutionalization did kind of exacerbate some of the concerns identified by the anti-psychiatry movement, particularly just a huge surge in psychiatric medication prescriptions, and as a result, big profits to big pharma companies who were making those drugs, which only boosted their power in the mental health field. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Enter the anti-psychiatry movement, a movement led by psychiatrists. And it all starts with the charismatic Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing. During his work with individuals grappling with schizophrenia, Laing became disillusioned with the conventional psychiatric treatments of the time. He saw them as barbaric and perhaps part of the problem. So, in 1955, he began a radical experiment. He set up a spacious, comfortable room with nice furniture where patients could spend time. He stripped away their psychiatric medications and gave them easy access to nursing care. Remarkably, within a mere year and a half, all 12 of the participating patients showed enough improvement to be discharged. However, within the span of a year, they all found themselves back in the hospital again. But rather than interpreting that as evidence that schizophrenia is a chronic, lifelong condition that could only somewhat be influenced by a person's environment, Laing concluded that there was instead something wrong with the world beyond those hospital walls. That idea became the foundation for his first book, The Divided Self, in which he essentially argues that schizophrenia was completely understandable. There's a quote that often gets attributed to Laing that goes, "Insanity is a perfectly sane reaction to an insane world." Who knows if he actually said that, but he believed that schizophrenia stemmed from an individual's struggle to reconcile the pressures and demands of society and interpersonal relationships with their own sense of self. This book spoke to the cultural zeitgeist and became an instant bestseller, and it made Laing a counterculture superstar. So to further expand upon the rising popularity of his ideas, Laing founded Kingsley Hall in 1965. This was a former community center and hostel, but he turned it into an experimental community. Here, therapists and patients with schizophrenia lived together. There were no locks, no restraints, no antipsychotic drugs. People could just come and go as they pleased, and daily life often involved unrestricted expressions of psychosis, hours-long overnight sessions of therapy, DMT and LSD experimentation, and visits from mystics, scholars, and celebrities. In fact, apparently Laing was close buds with Sean Connery, and even treated his anxiety by giving him LSD at the height of his James Bond fame. But this community only survived for 5 years. The residents who lived there described their time as exciting, intense, and often uncomfortable. Many of them wondered if R.D. Laing, or Ronnie as they referred to him, was himself insane. And although Kingsley Hall stayed true to its mission of being a safe haven that rejected authority and redefined mental illness, it also had a lot of issues. The living conditions were poor and deteriorated over time. Residents were isolated from the surrounding community rather than being integrated because the neighbors hated them. Crisis situations were frequent and often required residents to drop anything they were doing to help that one person in need. And it closed down after 2 people jumped off the roof. But despite all of these issues and a lack of evidence for this approach, Kingsley Hall was seen as a revolutionary step toward fundamentally changing perspectives towards psychiatric disorders, specifically psychotic disorders. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, psychiatrist Thomas Szasz published the book The Myth of Mental Illness in 1961. This book is considered a classic in psychology and essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the anti-psychiatry movement. So, I read it myself. In it, Szasz argues that mental illness is not a real medical condition. He criticized psychiatry for using vague, unscientific diagnoses and said that psychiatry belonged in the company of alchemy and astrology. Szasz posited that mental illnesses are actually a metaphor for problems in living. We all have struggles in life, and he viewed these diagnoses as constructs of society that actually pathologized normal human experiences and behavior. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, he makes some good arguments, and he's a very convincing writer. He talks about the medicalization of emotional and interpersonal issues, and in particular, at that time, psychiatric diagnoses were often wielded against individuals in order to place them into coercive treatment or involuntary commitment, particularly through the use of the court system. Unafraid of controversy, Szasz called psychiatry a coercive arm of the state due to its involvement in these practices.
It is my view that the use of psychiatry in the criminal law subverts and contaminates the judicial process and degrades and dehumanizes the individual accused or convicted of an offense.
Szasz believed that psychiatry perpetuated the myth of mental illness as a way of maintaining authority and relevance in society. And to support this idea, he pointed to historical examples of punitive psychiatry, in which psychiatric diagnoses were misused for political purposes. For example, drapetomania, which was a supposed mental illness that caused enslaved Africans to flee captivity, or sluggish schizophrenia, which was a diagnosis used in the Soviet Union to take credibility and rights away from political dissidents. I mean, even around the time that his book came out, the FBI said that Malcolm X and the North Carolina NAACP leader, Robert Williams, had schizophrenia, and black activists were said to have protest psychosis. This was used as a way to try to discredit their beliefs or to pathologize their anger. I'm not going to explore it much further, but punitive psychiatry could be a whole other video. And I'd love to explore how schizophrenia became a black disease starting in the 1950s. But let me know down in the comments if that's something that you'd want to hear more about. Szasz was pointing to real problems in the field, and he did so in a provocative way, which attracted a captive audience, but also significant criticism from his colleagues and the general public. You see, Szasz believed that mental illness was not actually an illness because it didn't meet the cellular pathology definition of disease, which identifies diseases based on lesions to cells, tissues, and organs that can be identified in an autopsy. Of course, today, the advancements in neuroscience and biology have shown that there is almost certainly a neurological basis for psychiatric illnesses. But even at that time, this definition was excessively narrow. I mean, by Szasz's own logic, other medical issues like migraines would also be simply a myth. Though I doubt anyone experiencing a migraine would agree. But the other issue with this restrictive perspective and definition is that it excludes and dismisses the fact that suffering and impairment of functioning are important markers of disease. Szasz trivialized the kind of pain and distress and struggles that people with severe mental illnesses often face. He often called them attention seekers and imposters and called them irresponsible. He viewed diagnoses as excuses. I can tell that I'm getting worked up about this because it's frustrating to have that stigma attached to mental health, to mental illness. But I know that Szasz was trying to come from a good place. He once said about talk therapy that the goal is to assume more responsibility and therefore gain more liberty and more control over one's life. He was a libertarian, and his libertarian perspective on personal responsibility gave power back to the individual. But the flip side of that is that it also placed blame on them if they couldn't cure themselves. It's all in your hands. Just fix your life. Simple, right? Szasz never worked in a setting that primarily treated the seriously mentally ill. And I wonder if that lack of exposure colored his thinking. In his own practice, Szasz refused to give medications to any patient that he saw and would actually take them off of medications that they were taking. One of his patients, unfortunately, committed suicide 6 months after he took them off of lithium. But that's actually not even the worst of it. In 1969, Szasz co-founded an anti-psychiatry lobbying organization called the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. The other founder was the Church of Scientology. You see, L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, had a grudge against psychiatry. Now, growing up, he had great experiences in the field, and he even volunteered at a psychiatric clinic. His interest in the mind actually led him to author Dianetics in 1949, which he had hoped would become a new form of psychological treatment. Ultimately, it was rejected by the psychological and medical establishments as pseudoscientific. But then, in 1951, everything changed. His wife ended up consulting with a psychiatrist about his own increasingly violent and irrational behavior, and the psychiatrist recommended that Hubbard be institutionalized for her safety. In anger, he kidnapped his wife and then released her, and then instead kidnapped his daughter and then fled to Havana. From that point on, L. Ron Hubbard hated psychiatry and eventually came to believe that psychiatrists are ancient enemies from billions of years ago or something. I don't know. In any case, this grudge made its way into the writings and doctrine of Scientology. Followers commit to never take psychiatric drugs, and they reject psychology outright. And the church's goal is to totally eradicate psychiatry and psychology as medical specialties.
I've never agreed with psychiatry, ever. Before I was a Scientologist, I never agreed with psychiatry. And then when I started studying the history of psychiatry, I started realizing more and more why I didn't agree with psychiatry.
But this was not some hollow belief. Scientologists actually attempted to secretly infiltrate the World Federation for Mental Health and the National Association of Mental Health in Britain in an attempt to turn official policy against mental health treatment. Now, the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, or CCHR, just gave Scientology a formal avenue to influence politics. And with Thomas Szasz as the co-founder, the organization gained a semblance of credibility as it promoted its radical anti-psychiatry agenda. And I'm not being hyperbolic there. You know, the CCHR doesn't just criticize psychiatry. It genuinely believes that all psychiatrists are criminals. They often call for their arrest and incarceration, and even spread wild conspiracy theories, including one that claimed that Osama bin Laden's psychiatrist was actually the real mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. Their lobbying efforts and public awareness campaigns have been remarkably successful. One of their most notable achievements was their media campaign against Prozac in the 90s, which led to a significant drop in sales. But they have other tactics too, including requesting tours at psychiatric hospitals, then publishing scathing reports that highlight issues, and calling for formal investigations and pushing for reforms that aligned with their own ideology. They've also continued to covertly spread their ideas to the general public through partnerships with legitimate organizations such as the NAACP and the National Action Network. This strategic approach has allowed them to extend their influence far beyond the confines of Scientology. Thomas Szasz eventually left the organization, but not before suffering serious damage to his reputation. Regardless, he continued to write and speak on his anti-psychiatry views until his death. Now, I mainly focused on Szasz and Laing as the leaders of this movement, but they were hardly alone. So if you want to know the whole history, which I won't be covering, then you need to look into the other interesting and influential figures like David Cooper, Michael Foucault, Peter Breggin, Franco Basaglia, and Jeffrey Mason. As the decades passed, the anti-psychiatry movement lost much of its momentum. This was partly due to a shift in culture. It shifted away from the anti-establishment counterculture of the 60s and 70s to instead a more conservative mainstream culture of the 80s. But it also waned because the field of psychiatry had responded to most of the legitimate concerns of anti-psychiatry by making significant changes, either willingly or by force due to legal action. It overhauled the DSM to tackle critiques of unreliability and vagueness of diagnoses. Large institutions were closed, legal reforms were enacted to protect patient rights and autonomy, there was a significant reduction in coercive practices, and the last lobotomy was performed in 1967. Thanks to the anti-psychiatry movement, ethical standards and oversight became a major focus for the field. But I don't want to give the impression that the anti-psychiatry movement died in the 60s, because its sentiments continued to simmer and produce change. In the 1970s, the gay rights movement criticized the classification of homosexuality as a mental illness in the DSM, which led to its complete removal by 1986. The 1980s also saw a reduction in antipsychotic dosages, which helped minimize side effects. Electroconvulsive therapy became a marginalized form of treatment, and researchers began to identify biological causes of particular disorders, such as schizophrenia. The field also adopted a biopsychosocial model of understanding illness that not only considered a person's brain chemistry, but also their genetic predispositions, the influence that their thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and perceptions have on their behavior, the impact of their social environment, relationships, cultural norms, socioeconomic status, family dynamics, and societal structures on their mental well-being. Over time, the anti-psychiatry movement became more and more diffuse, to the point that it only existed as a collection of ideas rather than a cohesive movement. You see, the anti-psychiatry movement of the 60s was largely an intellectual movement led by psychiatrists in academic circles. And while it had wide-ranging effects for the larger population, there was very little interest in actually giving the microphone to people who were directly negatively affected by psychiatry. And so, without academics and professionals leading the charge, it makes sense that this movement would lose steam. But that all started to change with the dawn of the internet.
America Online, a new way to use your computer.
Email, instant messages. There's no better way to keep in touch.
Suddenly, you could instantaneously connect with someone a mile away or 10,000 miles away. Anti-psychiatry blogs, websites, and forums could now reach millions of people. And instead of being led by scholars and doctors, these new communities were led by individuals who identified as mental health consumers, survivors of psychiatric treatment, and ex-patients. Today, you're only a click away from a peer support network like the Icarus Project, or how about an advocacy website like Mad in America, or an online community on Reddit, or on Facebook, or on an AOL Instant Messenger chat room. The Consumer, Survivor, and Ex-Patient Movement, or CSX movement, has become the new home of anti-psychiatry, and it's really flourished over the past 3 decades. I mean, from my perspective, anti-psychiatry sentiments are stronger now than they've ever been in my lifetime. Many of the talking points from the 60s are resurfacing, like questioning the validity of psychiatric diagnoses or doubting the effectiveness of psychiatric medications, feeling that everyday life is being medicalized or claiming that mental illness isn't real, and worrying about coercive practices that continue today. But there are also modern critiques to match our modern world. People are increasingly worried about the over-reliance on medication and the close ties between psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry, which can lead to biased research, overprescription, and a focus on profit over patient well-being. There's also strong criticism of pharmaceutical companies' aggressive direct-to-consumer marketing tactics and concern about using psychiatry to manage and suppress behavior that deviates from social norms instead of addressing the underlying social or economic issues. And while psychotherapy was generally held up as an example of proper care in the old anti-psychiatry movement, this new movement dishes out its fair share of criticisms. Many people question therapy's effectiveness and point out to the inconsistent outcomes that often depend on the therapist's skill and biases. They also express concerns about the power imbalance in the therapist-client relationship, which can sometimes lead to exploitative situations. Additionally, there are complaints about the high cost of therapy, making it inaccessible. And the field is pretty white and female, meaning it's just not a very diverse set of therapists available to see people who are looking for treatment. And some even feel that therapy is just a scam. Now, as someone who went to school in this field, works in this field, and has been a patient in this field, I feel like I have a unique perspective on psychiatry, psychotherapy, and psychology as a whole. But it also places me in this weird, precarious position because to some watching this video, unless I fully agree with them, they're gonna think that I'm a shill who must be getting paid under the table, or I'm just trying to protect my position of power and authority. And to others, unless I fully agree with them, then they'll think that I'm a traitor or a provocateur who's just trying to get attention by spreading misinformation. But that doesn't worry me so much because the truth is that I'm pretty sure that a vast majority of people, maybe like you watching this video right now, are capable of having a more nuanced perspective on this issue. And I guess I give that preface because, to be totally honest, I think that many of the critiques brought by the anti-psychiatry movement, both past and present, are a good thing. They serve a valuable purpose. Constructive scrutiny and criticism point out shortcomings that often propel mental health care toward a more effective and progressive model. Anti-psychiatry is not some fringe movement. It's an acknowledgement of entirely real issues that have harmed or potentially could harm people. We should be able to question things and put them to the test. That's the scientific method. I don't know, maybe that opinion doesn't come as any surprise. I mean, if you watch my videos on this channel, you see that I criticize the field fairly often. So, based on the definition that I gave at the beginning of this video, I am also part of the anti-psychiatry movement. But there are legitimate ethical and legal conversations to be had regarding current practices, like what should be pathologized and who should be given authority to determine that. When is it appropriate to consider pharmacological treatment or consider coming off of pharmacological treatment? When are the side effects of certain medications worth it or not? How do you remove undue influence of big pharma in this field? How do you standardize care for consistent results without making it impersonal or generic? When, if ever, should someone be compelled by law to be hospitalized or obtain treatment? These issues are just as relevant today as they were 60 years ago, and we see them play out even in our popular media, like the recent Britney Spears conservatorship controversy that brought up debates about whether infringing on a person's autonomy and rights is acceptable. How do you strike a balance between protecting someone's well-being and respecting their right to make decisions about their own lives? I've actually worked with a fair number of clients who were under conservatorship. I've also worked with people who were court-ordered to receive treatment from me. I've even been involved in having certain individuals involuntarily hospitalized. Those encounters have profoundly shaped and informed my understanding of mental illness and the complexity in treatment. I've wanted to talk about my experiences for a long time, not just to offer insights into the reality of what that kind of a situation can look like, but also to reflect on my own personal thoughts and feelings around the ethics of that kind of treatment. So I made a whole other video to accompany this one. It's far more candid and casual, no script, just space for personal introspection and exploration. So I don't even know how well I express all of my thoughts, but if you're interested in seeing that video, you can watch it right now over on Nebula. And I posted it over there because it's fairly different from the usual stuff that I put on YouTube. And it also deals with some heavy topics that quite frankly get punished when discussed over here. So If you're not familiar with Nebula, it's the streaming service that me and my creator friends built. And what I love about having that platform is I can experiment and try new video ideas without having to worry about the algorithm or being demonetized. It's also just been an amazing support financially over the years because the money from people subscribing on Nebula directly supports me and the things that I make. So if you're a Nebula subscriber and you're watching this right now, thank you. But also, why are you watching it over here, not over there instead? But it's not all about me. Nebula is actually a good deal for you all too, because not only do you get access to that video that I was talking about, but all of our exclusive videos that we don't publish here on YouTube. And you also get access to all of the detailed, high quality, original content from other creators that can't be found anywhere else. And I've got recommendations. You might as well start by learning about some weird medical curiosity with my buddy Midlife Crisis. Love that guy, even though he thinks that the heart is better than the brain. And then you might as well watch a 2-hour video on the relationship between John Lennon and Yoko Ono by Lindsay Ellis. And then why not cap it off with a 30-second comedy sketch by Man Carrying Things? Really, the world's your oyster. And at least from my perspective, Nebula is the pearl. Is that too much? Whatever. The point is, if you subscribe, then you can watch all my videos first before they get uploaded on YouTube. They're all ad-free. And if you get bored with me, then there's a whole catalog of experimental, bigger budget, and more exciting videos by creators that are way cooler than me. So if that sounds like something you're into, then click that link down in the description, nebula.tv/neurotransmissions. That'll support me directly, and you get 40% off the annual plan, which is as little as $2.50 a month. Or you can spend $300 and get Nebula's lifetime membership, which means no monthly fees, just one payment, and you get Nebula forever, and you never have to worry about it ever again. Totally up to you, but just putting it out there. Okay, enough of me talking about this other video. Let's get back to this video. Even though I understand the criticisms and express my own, it's hard to hear critiques of my field and not feel some degree of defensiveness. I published a video a while back about bad therapists, and as part of that, I asked people to leave their experiences with bad therapists down in the comments, and it's really hard to read those. I don't want them to be true. I know how great things could actually be, but also acknowledge that we still have a lot of work to do. I've also seen comments from people claiming that mental illness doesn't exist, that psychotropic medications are universally harmful, or that therapy and psychiatry are straight up scams that are trying to steal from people or hurt people. It's a full-on rejection. You know, I think that that's another reason why so many people bristle at the anti-psychiatry label. I don't want to abolish the field. I want to focus on trying to make these institutions better through constructive criticism. But that doesn't feel very anti, does it? New terms have popped up as a way of separating out these subgroups, such as critical psychiatry. And part of the reason for that is to distance it from the movement that holds more radical beliefs. And it's true. Extremist perspectives have become more common online, often in conspiratorial corners of the internet, and also thanks to Scientology, as I talked about earlier. These are the kind of folks who might assume that any psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist, or mental health professional is a malicious co-conspirator that's trying to keep you miserable, or line their pockets, or maybe some idiot who doesn't really care about you at all, or just a tool of big pharma to control the masses. They believe that mental health, as a field, is inherently harmful, and therefore, they want to burn it all down. I have to confess that I have a very low tolerance for this perspective because A, I find it annoying, and B, it just seems obviously wrong. Like, we've specifically focused on the flaws in this video, but there's a lot of good being done. I have witnessed firsthand the way that therapy and psychiatry can transform someone's life for the better. And beyond my own observations, I hear the same thing from clients, friends, coworkers, strangers on the internet who leave comments. Now, I realize that not everyone has the same experience, but that's kind of the point. Psychiatry and psychotherapy are multifaceted fields with a diverse array of practices, some of which are more helpful and some of which are less so. And likewise, humanity is diverse, and what's helpful to one person could be harmful to another. Regardless, I don't think that we should ignore or discount those who hold radical anti-psychiatry views. I mean, we might dismiss their beliefs, but we shouldn't dismiss what informs those beliefs. If someone has suffered harm from treatment, that's real. Their distrust is real. And it's a sad irony that sometimes that distrust is exploited by groups with a vested interest in promoting anti-psychiatry's extreme ideas, such as Scientology, or homeopathy companies peddling all-natural remedies, or certain podcasters or media personalities or influencers who hawk unregulated supplements for personal gain. And if we're being critical, of psychiatry, then it's only fair to take a critical eye to the legacy of anti-psychiatry as well, which has had its own share of harmful outcomes. As I alluded to before, deinstitutionalization was a huge failure. Today, many of the people with severe mental illness aren't coerced into long-term treatment, but rather put into jail. The policy changes that were intended to protect patient rights can also prevent someone from getting the care that they need when they're in crisis. Some argue that these laws do more to protect a patient's psychosis than the patient themselves, and professionals are forced to watch them waste away, but with their rights intact. But honestly, the biggest harm of the anti-psychiatry movement, particularly today, is the stigmatization of mental health and mental illness. Undoubtedly, it has contributed to a general distrust of mental health professionals, psychotropic medication, and the field altogether, which deters people from getting help when they might really need that support. I am positive that I have not seen and never will see certain people because anti-psychiatry has made them reluctant to seek treatment. So what do we do with all this? What's next? Well, if you're like me and you find yourself in that middle ground where you want to see change and improvement, then there's lots of ideas that could address the modern concerns of the anti-psychiatry movement. First and foremost, countries should invest in more programs that engage in early intervention and that share decision-making with patients. We should probably have more laws restricting the level of influence that pharmaceutical companies have. For example, when I worked with psychiatrists, pharma reps would regularly show up with free lunch for everybody so that they could answer questions about their medication. That seems like it should be illegal. We should probably also stop direct consumer advertising because that's actually contributed pretty substantially to over-medication in the United States. Insurance companies should adjust their copay schedule to make accessing therapy services more affordable so that patients aren't burdened by the cost due to the frequency that people usually go to therapy. Licensing boards should remove as many barriers as possible and raise awareness on how to report unethical and illegal behavior taken by mental health professionals. And federal and local governments should provide services and amenities that we know are good for people, particularly the seriously mentally ill. Decent housing, easily accessible treatment, social clubs, vocational rehab, positive regard, respect, empathy, family support, safety, the list goes on. These are hard tasks to accomplish, but they'll be impossible to accomplish if we bury our heads in the sand or adopt an extreme stance that seeks to dismantle everything. I guess the underlying message is extremism is bad. It's not helpful to view everything related to mental health as fake or universally harmful or a method of control, because it's simply not true. And on the other end, it's not helpful to view mental health as immutable or beyond criticism or fixed now because everything bad only ever happened in the past, because that also is simply not true. Often, the truth lies somewhere in between. This field that I work in, very much like the clients that I treat, can embody both positive and negative aspects at the same time. And perhaps it's the therapist in me, but I feel far more interested in focusing on growth and progress rather than being the ultimate judge. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm Micah. I need to go inside because it's raining.